Websites depend on good user authentication to verify the identities of visitors. And they depend on well-designed access controls to regulate what each visitor can see and do. These are essential techniques for every web developer to learn. However, it can be easy to make mistakes, which can allow hackers to gain access that they don't deserve. It's important to understand the potential pitfalls so you can put smart protections in place. In this course, we will learn the fundamentals of user authentication and access control. We will learn best practices for securing digital identities and to prevent unauthorized access to websites. My name is Kevin Skoglund. I'm a longtime web developer who can tell you firsthand why it's important to get authentication and access control right. I'm excited to share what I've learned with you. Let's begin by looking at what user authentication is and why we use it. Authentication is a process which confirms a person's identity. It ensures that a person is authentic, that they are who they say they are. Authentication is a fundamental tool for controlling access. We usually authenticate someone before we grant them access to an area or before we allow them to perform certain actions. Authentication and access control go hand in hand. Authentication and access control are used in technology, but they're also used in the real world. In fact, the key is one of the simplest forms of authentication and access control. Anyone who possesses the key to a lock is authorized to have access to whatever it secures. It might be access to a building, an elevator, a room, or a filing cabinet. If you have the key, access is permitted. Authentication has become ubiquitous on the web. Most websites have special areas that require a user to log in to gain access. The special areas might be pages inside an admin area that only administrators should be able to see. It might be pages that only paid subscribers are allowed to use. Or it might be an online account that allows a user to access a bank account, or to purchase items and charge them to a credit card. Or a system might perform authentication to see if a user is allowed to perform privileged actions, such as transferring money or deleting records in a database. Authentication frequently involves providing credentials. Credentials are any items used to prove that someone is who they say they are. In the real world, if you travel to another country, you often present credentials in the form of a passport. Your passport establishes your identity and your right to travel from one country to another. It's like a key, but one that's linked to your identity and not easily shared. On the web, when we say credentials, most of the time we mean a person's username and password. If a user can provide a correct username and password, then the user is authenticated and allowed to have access. Like a passport. In this movie, we'll discuss some of the ways to authenticate someone. These different forms of authentication can be grouped into categories which we call authentication factors. There are 3 authentication factors. The first factor is knowledge. Knowledge-based authentication will test for information that the user knows. The user is authenticated if they know the correct information. The second factor is ownership. Ownership-based authentication will test for an item that the user has in their possession. The user is authenticated if they possess that item. The third factor is inherence. Inherence-based authentication will test for an attribute that the user has. The user is authenticated if they inherently have that attribute. It's worth memorizing these 3 factors because they come up frequently in security. The easiest and most common way to learn them is using the phrase, something the user knows, something the user has, something the user is. Let's look at some examples of each one. The classic example of knowledge-based authentication is a password. You're authenticated if you know the password. A numeric PIN code or your mother's maiden name are other commonly used examples. The classic example of ownership-based authentication is a key. If you possess a key, then you're authenticated to have access. An ID badge, a ticket for admission to an event, or a credit card are other examples. The best example of inherence-based authentication is your fingerprints. Fingerprints are a unique trait for each person. The sound of your voice could be another example, or the way that you look. These factors are not new or unique to the internet. Let's look at some more examples of real-world authentication. As we go through them, I want you to think about which of the authentication factors would apply to each one. You might have a safe that stores jewelry and valuables that has a combination lock. Police might use fingerprints and DNA as evidence. Banks use ATM cards and PIN codes. The legal system uses signatures for contracts and loans. Private clubs might use a password in order to gain entrance. Do you see the different kinds of authentication factors at work? While authentication is not a new concept, it is trickier to authenticate someone over the internet. The user is at a distance, and we must receive and review their authentication factors remotely to make sure that they're not impersonating an authorized user. And it's challenging to examine items in their possession, like metal keys or documents, or to see their appearance. And those are two of our three authentication factors. The distance is the reason that entering a username and a password into a web form is so commonly used for remote authentication. It's an easy way to submit a knowledge-based factor. One common misconception about authentication factors is that they need to be unique for each individual user. They do not need to be unique. For example, if it's something the user knows, but not necessarily something that only the user knows. A password or a key can be shared by a group of people and still be a valid authentication factor. Now, certainly, it is stronger authentication when the factor is unique, but it's not a fundamental requirement. I want to share three of my favorite examples of authentication with you. The first example is from the folktale Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. A man and his brother overhear a group of thieves use the password to their secret den where they store their treasure. Famously, that password is Open Sesame. Once they know the password, then they can open the cave on their own. Unfortunately, Ali Baba's brother goes to the cave to steal the treasure and then forgets the password after he's inside, so the thieves catch him and kill him. It's a classic example of the knowledge-based authentication factor. The second example is from the film Raiders of the Lost Ark. If you recall, there's a medallion with instructions to find the entrance to the temple holding the Lost Ark. The Nazis end up with knowledge about what's written on one half of the medallion, but Indiana Jones possesses the actual medallion, which has important text on both sides. The medallion must also be put on top of a staff to shine a light on the entrance. Access to the temple requires something Indiana Jones possesses and something he knows. In this movie, we'll examine credentials, which are the most common form of online user authentication. Credentials typically means username and password. The term is actually broader, but on the internet, they're used almost synonymously. Forms asking for a username and password are easy for developers to implement, and users are already familiar with the concept. Every username on your website should be unique. After all, we're trying to authenticate a particular person. We don't want to have two users named John Doe. We need to have John Doe 1 and John Doe 2, so that we can tell them apart and control their access separately. The usernames can be different from other websites, but they don't have to be. In most cases, someone's email address is a suitable username. An email address is already unique, and most users can remember it easily. In fact, we'll see later how an email address is frequently used as a proxy for a user's online identity, such as when they forget their password. We want credentials to be secure, but not burdensome for users. Users likely have many online accounts that they need to manage. Using an email address as a username helps users without weakening security, because the password combined with the username becomes the knowledge-based authentication factor. Similarly, it's common for a login form to display the username in a form input using plain text, because it's not a secret. But the password is protected, and we do that by using a form input with type password. The password input type will replace each character with dots, and that prevents anyone who may be peeking over a user's shoulder from easily reading it. We'll talk a lot more about passwords in the coming chapters, but here are a few more tips about collecting credentials. You shouldn't prevent the user or JavaScript from pasting values into input fields, and you should avoid adding background images to those fields. The reason is that many password managers have browser plugins that add background images to those fields, and then users can select and paste in values that are stored in the password manager. We want to encourage password managers, so let's not put up roadblocks to using them. The third is that you should configure HTTPS on your website to ensure that usernames and passwords will travel over an encrypted channel from the user's browser to the server. That prevents them from being observed by anyone watching the network traffic. You also want to be mindful of account enumeration. You don't want someone to be able to figure out a list of valid usernames by trial and error. Let's imagine a website for a group that has a confidential list of members. If I type in an email address with a wrong password and the website replies username found or password incorrect, then I will have discovered one of the members. If I can confirm a username is valid, then it makes it easier to guess the password. We've learned the three authentication factors: knowledge, ownership, Inherence. 3 factors can be combined for multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is when authentication requires factors from more than one category. You may also hear it referred to as two-factor authentication because combining 2 factors is most common. You also may see it abbreviated as MFA or 2FA. Requiring 2 factors increases security because an unauthorized user or an attacker would have to meet 2 different requirements. For example, knowing someone's username and password would not be enough on its own. The credentials are 1 factor, something that the user knows. The second factor could be something the user has or something the user is. That makes faking user authentication a lot harder for an attacker, but an authentic user should have no trouble meeting both requirements. It's important to note that multi-factor authentication does not use several factors from the same category. For example, knowing a username, a password, and a phone number would not be multi-factor authentication. These are 3 pieces of information, but they're all from the same category, something the user knows. Therefore, it's not multi-factor. I'll give 2 illustrations that show why this is important. Let's imagine that we have a safe, which has a lock with a combination dial and a lock that requires a key. This safe is using multi-factor authentication. It requires the combination of the first lock and also the key that unlocks the second lock. That's 2 factors, something you know and something you have. If someone steals my key, they still won't have the combination. If someone figures out the combination, they still won't have my key. Now, in contrast, let's imagine a door that has 2 locks on it. This door requires 2 items to be in the person's possession. But if the set of keys were stolen, with both keys on the same keyring, then it's easy to see why 2 items in a single factor can have the same weakness. Now, certainly having 2 locks is more secure than 1, but it's inferior to multi-factor authentication. A familiar real-life example of multi-factor authentication is bank ATMs. Something the user has is the bank card for the ATM. Something the user knows is the PIN number that goes with it. If I lose my wallet, someone can't steal all my money because they still don't know my PIN number. If someone learns my PIN number, they still don't have the bank card that's in my wallet. Typically, multi-factor authentication on the web begins by having a user create an account with a username and password. Now we have 1 factor, something the user knows. Next, the website would help the user to set up an additional factor. Most often, the second factor will be something the user possesses. And the 3 most common techniques are to send an SMS text message, to use a software authenticator, or a hardware authenticator. The SMS text message is the most popular technique. It's likely that you've used it. The website sends a text message to a mobile phone number with a passcode that must be either entered into the website or that requires some kind of an SMS response. The concept is that if you can receive the messages, then you must possess the phone. There are 2 factors. The username and password is something you know, and your phone becomes something you have. The second technique is to use a software authenticator. For example, there are several popular software authenticator programs that users can install on a smartphone. The website would help the user configure the software authenticator, and then for every login or other kind of authentication, it would ask the user to enter a code that the software provides. These codes are generated by the software algorithm using seed data that makes them unique, and the codes are frequently time-based, so that every minute the code changes. It's referred to as a time-based one-time password, or TOTP. The concept is that if you can access the code, you must currently possess the same device that you configured for access initially, and that becomes the second authentication factor. The third technique is to use a hardware authenticator. The website would help the user establish a hardware device as an authentication method. That hardware device is often a special-purpose security key that's connected to a computer or phone via USB or NFC. With each authentication, the website would send a request to that device, and the device would transmit a unique code as a response. A successful response from the hardware device indicates that the device you set up initially is currently in your possession. So you have both multi-factor authentication offers us some obvious security improvements over single-factor authentication. However, there are also some drawbacks and pitfalls that we should consider. First, multi-factor authentication does require extra effort and expense to set it up for a website. And the additional security layer adds friction to the authentication process. Every user must now take a second step to gain access. That second step is not always convenient. In my own experience, there have been times when my cell phone is in a different room or when I've left my hardware authentication device at home. There's a trade-off between convenience and increased security. You should consider whether a website needs that extra security and whether the users of the website will accept that trade-off. As a user myself, I demand that my financial institutions use MFA, but I do not want to spend the extra effort anytime I want to order a salad for lunch. As a general rule, users who are familiar with technology and online security are going to be more willing to use multi-factor authentication than users who are not. If you decide to use it, multi-factor authentication setup instructions for website users must be clear and easy to follow, and troubleshooting and recovery processes must be established. Consider, what is the recovery process if a user loses their cell phone, or if they lose their hardware authentication device? There are also strengths and weaknesses to the authentication factors that you choose. In particular, multi-factor authentication using SMS is extremely common, but it has many pitfalls that weaken it. The mobile phone receiving the SMS message can be lost or in someone else's possession. The SMS codes may be visible to others, even on a locked phone. Mobile phone SIM cards can be hijacked to allow someone else to receive the SMS messages. One common technique is for an attacker to trigger the SMS authentication message and then call the user or trick them into visiting a website so that they provide that code to the attacker. In truth, authentication using an SMS code is not actually something the user has. It is something the user knows. Something the user knows because the user is likely the only one who can access a secret that was sent to something the user has. That's fudging multi-factor authentication a little bit. For this reason, software authenticators and hardware authenticators are going to provide a stronger authentication factor. There are fewer ways to steal, undermine, or forge their data. Hardware security keys are one of the best choices. Yes, hardware security keys can still be lost or stolen, but unlike mobile phones, they're less likely to be left on a table or left behind in a taxi. So far, we've mostly considered multi-factor authentication using the knowledge and ownership factors. In this movie, we'll discuss the inherence factor and look at biometric authentication. Biometric authentication measures one or more physical traits of a person's body in order to authenticate them. In the word biometric, the bio is for body and the metric is for measuring. It's pretty synonymous with the inherence authentication factor, which is something the user is. The most common examples of biometric authentication are the Touch ID and Face ID technologies used on Apple iPhones, which other phone makers have since imitated. If you touch an iPhone that has Touch ID, it reads your fingerprint and compares it against authorized fingerprints. If you want to unlock a phone that has Face ID, the camera measures certain features of your face and compares the results to measurements stored for authorized faces. Biometric authentication can be used on its own, or it can be paired with another authentication factor for MFA. There are many biometric factors that can be used. It's a big area for current research. Measurements can include fingerprints, retina and iris scans, just like in the movies, facial recognition, and voice matching. You can scan the palm of someone's hand to measure the vein patterns. You could also use DNA, body geometry, gait analysis, which examines the way someone walks, and cranial resonance, which is the way that sounds vibrate inside someone's head. These are all interesting ways to measure unique properties that are difficult to forge. They're unique and for the most part permanent. Inherence can be a very strong factor to use for authentication. However, these properties are both a strength and a weakness. I wouldn't know how to forge the vein patterns in someone else's hand. But if someone ever figured out how to do it, you also can't update your vein patterns. There are large-scale databases that contain fingerprints, DNA, facial scans, even In this chapter, we will talk about passwords, and we will begin by discussing password hashing. The number one rule of working with user passwords is to never, ever store passwords in plain text. I cannot stress it enough. It is the minimum amount of security that every website must offer. If you ignore this advice, and those plain text passwords are leaked, then all users on your website will be compromised and their accounts will be vulnerable. Even worse, Other websites may be compromised because we know that users frequently reuse passwords on multiple sites. So please, for everyone's security, never store passwords in plain text. Instead, you should always hash the passwords before storing them. Some people may refer to this as encrypting the passwords, but it's not really encryption. An encryption algorithm is different from a hashing algorithm. An encryption algorithm transforms plain text into ciphertext so the original text cannot be read. However, that ciphertext can be decrypted, usually by using a password of some sort. The encryption is reversible. It's possible to retrieve the original plain text. A hashing algorithm transforms the plain text, but the process is one way and cannot be reversed. We can't get back the original plain text. The reason is that there's some data that's discarded during the transformation. If we can't reverse the process, you may wonder how we can authenticate a user by their password. It works according to a simple principle. The same inputs plus the same hashing algorithm always equals the same output. When a user initially sets up an account with a password, that password goes through a hashing algorithm and the result is stored in a database. Anytime the user tries to log in, the password input is run through that same hashing algorithm. If the output matches what's stored in the database, then we know the input must be the same. Same input, same algorithm, same output. If not, then we know that the attempted password was wrong. Let me give an illustration. Imagine that you take the text of a book and you sort all of the words in the book into alphabetical order. So as an example, let's say we have once upon a time until happily ever after. We sort that and get A after ever happily once time until. It's not possible to unsort those words and to recover the original text because important information was lost in the process. Specifically, the original position of each word was lost. You can't get it back using only the sorted word list. But if we have another book and we want to know if it's the same as the first book, we can also sort its words into alphabetical order and compare the results. If the second book has the same words, then the result of the sort will be the same. If the words are different, the result will be different. Now, simply sorting the words is a silly and flawed hashing algorithm, but it illustrates how the process works. So, which hashing algorithm should you choose? MD5 and SHA-1 were popular choices for encrypting passwords for many years, but they're no longer secure enough. Techniques and computing resources for cracking passwords have advanced, and weaknesses have been discovered in the algorithms. SHA-2, which can also be known as SHA-256 or SHA-512, remains a good choice, but I don't recommend it because there's an even better option. Blowfish, which is also sometimes known as bcrypt, is a hashing algorithm with several nice characteristics. Blowfish bcrypt is We want passwords to be strong and resistant to attempts to discover or guess them. Understanding password strength first requires learning about some common attacks, beginning with brute force attacks. Brute force attacks are when software systematically generates rapid-fire input trying to guess the correct value of a password. Imagine a three-wheeled combination lock, like a small luggage lock or the lock that might be on a briefcase. We know that with enough time, someone could figure out what the combination is through trial and error. You might approach it systematically, starting with 000, then 001, 002, until you finally get to 999. If you try every combination, then one of them has to be the right one to open the lock. This is a brute force attack. Passwords are longer and use letters, numbers, and symbols, not just numbers. A similar brute force attack might try AAA, AAB, AAC, and so on for every combination. We know it can be done, but we also know that it would take a longer time. The time required is increased because there's more possibilities to try in each of those positions. And if it was a longer password, then there would be more positions to try with each of those combinations. There's a formula we can use to estimate the total number of combinations we would need to try every single one. We call this the key space. Key is frequently a word used synonymously with password. The formula is the key space is the number of possibilities for each position raised to the power of the length or the number of total positions. In our combination lock example, each wheel has numbers 0 through 9, which is 10 possible values, and the 3 wheels are the key length. So the key space is 10 to the third power, or 10 times 10 times 10, which is 1,000 possible combinations total. If we were to make 1,000 attempts, we're guaranteed to find the right combination along the way. Measuring the key space is a useful way to compare the strength of different passwords and their resistance to brute force attacks. For example, if we modify the number of possibilities, then we increase the key space. The lock on my high school locker had a combination lock that had 3 numbers, but there was a dial that let me pick numbers from 0 through 39. The key space formula would be 40 to the third power, which is 64,000. So on average, we can expect it to take 64 times longer to brute force the combination to one of these locks than to the 3-wheeled lock we put on our luggage. Or we can increase the length of the password to increase the key space. If our combination lock had 4 wheels, the formula would be 10 to the 4th power, or 10,000 combinations. A 5th wheel would increase it to 100,000 combinations. The key space contains all of the combinations. Of course, we likely would not need to search the whole key space to stumble on the correct password. If we're really lucky, the correct password could be the very first one that we try. So the actual number of combinations we must try is almost certainly lower. But using the total key space, which represents the worst case scenario for a brute force attack, is useful to allow us to make comparisons. For example, the key space formula shows that the password length is more important than the range of characters allowed in each position. Both will increase the key space, but the password length provides an exponential increase in the combinations. Let's consider several locks and ask ourselves which lock will be the most difficult to brute force. First, we have 3 luggage locks with single digits on each wheel, 0 through 9. The first has 3 wheels, the second has 4 wheels, and the third has 5 wheels. Next, we have 2 locks with dials. The first one has a dial with numbers and a few letters added for 20 different possibilities total, and you rotate it 3 times to find the combination. The next one is the kind like I had in my high school locker with 40 possibilities and 3 turns of the dial. Which lock do you think would be the most difficult to brute force? Pause the movie if you want to take a moment to consider. Let's walk through them. The 3-wheel lock we already know is 10 to the third power for 1,000 combinations. Adding a 4th wheel increases it exponentially to 10,000 combinations, and adding a 5th wheel will increase it exponentially to 100,000 combinations. How do those compare to the dial locks? The first lock has 20 possibilities and 3 turns of the dial, which is 20 to the third power, or 8,000. Brute force attacks are affected by the size of the key space, but also by the speed that each attempt can be made. If I must try 1,000 combinations to brute force a lock, then my success may very well depend in part on how fast I'm able to input each of those combinations. The formula to determine the total time required to try all of the combinations is to take the key space, the possibilities in each position raised to the power of the key length, and multiply that by the time per attempt. If I must try 1,000 combinations and each input takes 2 seconds, then the total time is 2,000 seconds, which is 33 minutes and 20 seconds. If each input takes 3 seconds, then the total time increases to 50 minutes. As computer speeds increase, their time per attempt decreases, and cracking passwords through brute force attacks gets easier. Computers may be on a network or cooperating with botnets to work closely together and collectively decrease the time per attempt. Attackers may have access to high-end password cracking rigs with multiple computers working in highly efficient configurations, similar to Bitcoin mining computers. A password cracking cluster can perform 350 billion guesses every second, and that number is doubling every 2 or 3 years. Let's do a calculation. Imagine that we have a password cracking rig that can perform 100 billion hash operations per second. That means that each attempt takes 1 out of 100 billionth of a second. Let's consider a password with 8 characters, and each character has 72 possibilities. Uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and a few symbols. 72 possibilities raised to the power of 8 times 1 over 100 billion. It would take 2 hours to try every single combination and be sure that you found the password. Let's run the same calculation using a 10-character password. This time, it takes over a year to brute force the password. Those 2 extra characters made a really big difference. It's important to note that brute force attacks are usually not executed over the web. Communication with a web server is just not fast enough to perform billions of transactions per second. More often, brute force attacks are attempted locally on hashed passwords that are leaked through data breaches. Attackers set up their password cracking computers to hash every possible password to find one that matches the leaked hash value. Because their ultra-high-speed computer must hash each combination, we can throttle or slow down their attempts by choosing a hashing algorithm that is slow. That's one of the reasons why I recommended Blowfish or Bcrypt as a hashing algorithm. It is slow. It's not so slow that a user would be frustrated when they enter a password into a login page. A quarter-second pause would hardly be noticed. But when a computer wants to do 100 billion hashes every second, adding a quarter-second delay to each one is a speed killer. A website can also implement throttling. It could be throttled at a firewall or in the web application. After several login attempts, it could require the user to wait a certain amount of time before they can try again. Perhaps after every 20 failed attempts, the user must wait for 5 minutes to try again. It would be a minor inconvenience for a user, but it would throttle a brute force attack. Some login forms use something called an exponential backoff algorithm. Each failed attempt increases that wait time before the next attempt can be made. Computer speeds are always increasing, but there are techniques to make their workload more difficult. In this movie, we will discuss dictionary attacks, which are a variation on brute force attacks. Let's start with a question. Which password would be harder to crack using a brute force attack? Both of these passwords are the same length, and they have the same characters, they're just scrambled around. Using our formulas, they would be considered of equal strength. They have the same key space to search through, and we don't know whether a search is going to begin with the letter A or the letter Z. Okay, now a second question. Which one of these is more likely to actually be used in the real world? Dictionary is more likely because users prefer common words for their passwords. Hackers know this, so they prioritize dictionary words first. A dictionary attack is a brute force attack that prioritizes words in a dictionary over all of the random combinations. It's the same total time to search the full key space, but it greatly decreases the actual time. It tries the most likely combinations first, and then the less likely combinations later on. The dictionary used for a dictionary attack will include words that are in Webster's dictionary, like password and dragon, but also includes patterns like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or QWERTY, characters that are all in a row on a QWERTY keyboard. It also includes commonly used passwords like let me in, trust no one, or NCC 1701. If that's not In this movie, we will learn about salted passwords. If you're using Blowfish or Bcrypt, then you don't have to think about salted passwords, because the hashing algorithm handles them for you. But if you're using a different hashing algorithm, you may need it. We've seen that brute force or dictionary attacks can take a long time to try every combination to discover a password. It could take years to discover just one. But a password cracker does not have to conduct each brute force attack on passwords one by one. If we're using a standard hashing algorithm, then someone can take millions of combinations and pre-compute what the hash values would be. Now, it still takes a really long time to compute them all, but the work can be divided up, the work only has to be done once, and then the results can be shared with others. The result is a table of input and output, plain text passwords in one column, and the associated hash values in a second column. These are known as rainbow tables. If an attacker possesses a hashed password that uses a known algorithm, and also has a rainbow table of hashes for that algorithm, then discovering the original password is easy. You just look up the hash value in the second column of the rainbow table, and the password used to create it is right there in the first column. A database with 1 million passwords that's leaked in a data breach could be cracked in minutes. And it can be done by a low-skilled attacker with a low-powered computer. The complex, time-consuming computer effort was done ahead of time and then reused. A defense against rainbow tables is salting passwords. Salt is additional data added to the plain text before hashing. Think of it as like sprinkling a little something extra on top. In this example, I've added the string salt the before the password. Let's say our password is secret. The string salt the secret would be used as input to the hashing algorithm. An attacker using rainbow tables could still discover the input to the hashing algorithm was salt the secret, but that's not the password. If they entered that into the login form, it would hash it and come up with salt the secret, and the resulting hash would not match. Of course, if rainbow tables revealed that every password in a database had salt the at the front, then the technique would be obvious and could be easily worked around. It would be better to have a unique salt value for each password. We could use a value that's already in the database table of users. We just have to be careful that the salt value never changes, or legitimate passwords will yield different hashes and then stop working. Perhaps a better approach is to add a column to the database to store a long random salt value for each hash. If the database is leaked, the salt will be known, but it will have already prevented using a rainbow table or easily finding a pattern to the salting. The salt does not need to be secret to serve its purpose. Some hashing algorithms are designed to either accept a separate salt value or an initialization vector. In Blowfish or bcrypt, the salting is built in. A random salt value is generated, used for the hash, and then appended to the front of the hash. So the value stored in the database is actually the hash with the salt included. Then when a user attempts to log in, the Blowfish Our discussions in this chapter have touched on how some passwords are more resistant to brute force and dictionary attacks than others. In this movie, we will look explicitly at the specific characteristics that make a password strong. A strong password has character variety. We observed this when we were comparing locks. A wheel numbered from 0 to 9 had less possibilities than a dial numbered from 0 to 39. The dial had a larger key space to search. So we want to have passwords that make use of as many different types of characters as we can. We want to have uppercase letters, lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols. A strong password should be long. Our example with the locks showed that the lock with 5 wheels numbered 0 to 9 had a larger key space than the dial with 3 numbers that had more possibilities, 0 through 39. Based on how fast computers are today, I think that 10 characters is a minimum for user passwords, and 12 characters is a minimum for administrators. I actually recommend using 15 characters or more for everyone. That helps to future-proof your password as password cracking abilities keep increasing. A strong password should be hard to guess. Do not use personal information, like the name of your pet, a hobby, or your favorite sports team. Don't use words that are in the dictionary. Do not use keyboard, letter, or number patterns. Make your password resistant to educated guesses and to dictionary attacks. The best strong passwords are random. Random passwords are the most resistant to dictionary attacks. Humans are not great at creating randomness, but computers can do a better job, so let a computer generate the password for you. A strong password should also be unique. Do not reuse your passwords, and especially don't reuse a password that's used for an internal corporate system out in the world for an external account. Reusing passwords increases the chance that a data breach will reveal the password and then compromise several of your accounts at once. So a strong password has character variety, is long, hard to guess, is random, and is unique. How do you do that if you have many passwords to keep track of? They are difficult to remember. One strategy is to write down these passwords. Studies have shown that 1/3 of users write down their passwords. That's not ideal because now all your secret passwords are in one document, which you have to keep both easily accessible and well protected. Too often, strong passwords end up written on a post-it note attached to the computer monitor. The strong password increases your security, but not safeguarding it well enough harms your security. A better choice is to use password manager software, which is itself password protected and has a lot of other nice features. Password managers require a master password or other authentication factors to access an encrypted storage area that contains many other passwords. It's like a key ring with many keys. They can also generate random strong passwords for you. They can warn you if you reuse a password on more than one site, and most will also interface with a browser, allowing you to easily generate, store, and autofill passwords as you visit websites. They may also allow you to store other information and notes. In this chapter, we will consider how to manage user passwords over time, and we'll begin by discussing password requirements. In the last chapter, we discussed what it takes to have a strong password, and I hope that you will choose strong passwords for yourself that are long, random, unique, and have a variety of characters. But how do we get website users to pick strong passwords too? We can educate users about the importance of strong passwords, and we should definitely do that. But more effectively, we can impose password requirements whenever a user sets a password. We should require users to pick passwords with a minimum number of characters. I think the minimum length you should require is 10 characters, but I recommend 15 characters. It's important not to limit the length of passwords. Let users submit longer passwords if they want to. Longer passwords are awesome. Most hashing algorithms also don't care. They return a hash of the same length regardless of the length of the password. For example, if we hash a password with blowfish or bcrypt, the result string is always 60 characters long. It doesn't matter if we hash a single word or a whole paragraph of text. The result will be 60 characters. This standard size makes database storage convenient without having to be concerned for the length of the original passwords. We should also allow and encourage character variety. We know that variety has an exponential effect on the strength. Definitely do not limit the character variety. Many sites require users to choose passwords which include characters that are uppercase letters, lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols, as a way to force them to have variety. The presence of different character types can be validated using regular expressions. There are also code libraries that compute the strength of a password, which can be a good way to encourage users to make better choices without enforcing strict requirements. There are even code libraries that will object if a password has been found in a past data breach. We'll talk more about one of those in the next movie. Once you've chosen requirements, be sure to inform the user of the requirements up front. If the user can understand the requirements before they submit, they're more likely to submit a valid password on their first attempt. If a password does not meet the requirements, you should report all problems at the same time. A user will be frustrated if they must fix password issues multiple times to satisfy all the requirements. The website passwordfromhell.com pokes fun at this common design flaw. When you visit the website, it asks you to choose a password. But chances are your password won't meet all of its mysterious hidden requirements. And if you make changes, it will reveal new requirements you didn't know about. It seems impossible to satisfy it. It's a good and common practice to ask for a password twice when you're setting it. This prevents a typo from locking out a user accidentally. Do not ask users to provide a password hint for display if they forget their password. Some users will simply type the password itself as their hint or include enough information that allows an educated guess. It's also not advisable to require passwords to be changed regularly. Research has shown that rotating passwords adds little to security, but it makes it more likely that passwords will be weak or be written down. Many users will try to work around this forced rotation so that they use the same password but add a number to the end that they change each time, from 1 to 2 to 3 and so on. It's better to encourage users to choose strong passwords and stick with them. Of course, you will want to force users to change passwords if there's ever any indication of a potential compromise to an account or to the database. A great resource for password requirements and related guidelines is the Digital Identity Guidelines put out by the National Institute of Science and Technology, otherwise known as NIST. It walks through issues like password complexity and rotation. It's a solid resource for guidance on this topic. In this movie, we will discuss password theft and password reuse. In 2013, Target, a popular US retail store, had a data breach. Hackers stole credentials from one of Target's third-party contractors, and then they used those credentials to harvest data from 41 million credit cards as unsuspecting customers ran their credit cards at the checkout counter. Target's losses were estimated at $500 million. Plus, Target settled a multi-state lawsuit for another $18.5 million. And it all began with one set of credentials. Credential theft is a big deal, and it's widespread. The CBS News program 60 Minutes found that 80% of security breaches were caused by either weak or stolen passwords. Hackers prefer credentials because they grant access and they also give the appearance of a legitimate user. It leaves less evidence behind, doesn't trigger alerts, and that lowers the chance of discovery. Credentials also frequently work in more than one system. Password theft and password reuse go hand in hand. Credentials are commonly stolen in several ways. Attackers can make educated guesses, often by using social media to research their target. We know that attackers can also use brute force to get through the passwords. Passwords can be stolen by key logging. Keyloggers are malware on a computer that records the keys as a user types. Phishing attacks are extremely common. Phishing is when a hacker tricks a user into providing their credentials, usually by sending an email with a link to a website that impersonates another website that the user trusts, like their bank. Or it could be through database theft, usually by exploiting weaknesses in a website's code to reveal its database contents. Let me give you another real-world example. In 2016, John Podesta, the chair of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, was hacked using a phishing attack. And rather famously, his emails were published online. His Apple ID password was visible in one of those emails. It was runner4567. This was not a strong password. It includes one of his well-known hobbies and a predictable number pattern. Even worse, Podesta reused that weak password in several other places. Once it was discovered, hackers immediately used it to steal and erase data from his iCloud account, his iPad, and his iPhone, and to take over his Twitter account. A useful tool to alert you to credentials leaked in data breaches is a website called Have I Been Pwned? You pronounce it pwned, even though it has no O in it. It's a web In this movie, we will discuss what to do when users forget their passwords. Fundamentally, what we need is another way to authenticate that person so that they can set a new password. So we have to ask, what else would prove their identity? We could use a different knowledge-based authentication factor. We would have to be careful, though, to choose something that's privileged information. I'd be reluctant to use a social security number, a driver's license number, or an account number, because those can be discovered through other means. I would only use them along with another authentication factor. Some sites use security challenge questions. The user provides answers to these questions when they first sign up, and then if they lose their password, the questions and answers are used to authenticate them. For example, it might ask for the name of the high school that you attended. Now, I don't like security challenge questions because they get reused, and the answers can often be discovered with just a little bit of research. Another technique is to establish security codes ahead of time that can be used to recover access. A website would provide those codes to users when they set up their access, and it would be up to the user to store the codes somewhere safe. These codes are unique data that creates a good knowledge factor to use. But the reason the user doesn't know their password could also be that they lost their laptop or their hard drive is broken, and those might hold those same security codes. The most common technique used today is to send the user an email to authenticate them and to reset their password. This technique makes the assumption that only the user should have access to that email account. In many cases, the user authenticated that email address when they signed up initially. The email account becomes a proxy for their identity. Of course, that's a big assumption that could be wrong, but for most websites, user authentication by email is considered good enough. I will explain how the password reset using email typically works. The user would go to the website and submit the username they want to reset. The website should respond positively, even if that username doesn't exist, so that it doesn't create an account enumeration vulnerability. The website should not simply send a new password to their email address. The new password may be observed in transit, or the user may file that email away and keep it for years, so that it might be leaked later on. It's also important not to change the password immediately. The user should still be able to log in while the old credentials are being reset. If the reset invalidates the old credentials immediately, then anyone could deny access to authorized users simply by resetting their passwords. Instead, the common approach is to send an email containing a reset link. The website generates a random unique token and stores it with the user's record in the database. It's useful to store the token generation time too, so that the token can be made valid only for a limited time. Then the website sends an email that has a link whose URL includes the token. The user receives the email, clicks on the link, and is taken to a page that allows them to set a new password. And then finally, the password is changed in the database and the token is deleted. The token acts like a one-time ticket to bypass the usual login. One benefit of this technique is that it's self-service. It's an automated process that doesn't require any customer service staff. A user can reset their password at any time of day. If more security is needed, a second authentication In this chapter, we will discuss access control, and we'll start by learning about insecure references. Insecure references are a vulnerability that frequently affects websites. An insecure direct object reference, or IDOR for short, is when a system allows access to a privileged resource without limiting access to only privileged users. Put more simply, a user can access something they shouldn't be able to access. Let's look at an example. Imagine that you make a purchase online and the transaction ends by displaying a receipt. The URL for the receipt ends with an ID number, 29481. That number is a direct reference to the receipt page. What if you change that ID to 29480? You might see the receipt for the purchase that was right before yours. You might see personal information, credit card data, and the items that were purchased. You shouldn't be able to view that information, but the direct reference is insecure. The receipt page lacks proper access controls. It should be authenticating each user and verifying that the user is allowed to view the receipt. Websites often have password-protected areas. Every single page that's part of a password-protected area should confirm that the user has been authenticated and has the correct access privileges to view the page. If not, it should redirect them to a login page or to an error page. Websites also frequently have pages that are specific to one user. It might be a page for viewing and updating the user's personal or billing information, or a page with links to past orders, a page to share personal photos, or an area to send and receive messages. Those pages need access control to ensure that only the intended user can view them. It's also not just web pages. Assets like images, videos, and PDF files may allow direct access and need to be access controlled. If a website provides an API to access its data, then it may need access controls too. How do we establish access controls and prevent these kinds of insecure references? First, we should ensure that access control is on all the pages and assets that need it. We can do that through automated software tests, manual testing, or a code review. Assets like images and PDF files that need access control can be trickier. Assets that need to be secured should not be directly referenced by web pages. For example, instead of just linking to the location of a PDF file on the server, a link could go to application code that checks for authorized access before it retrieves the PDF file and returns it to the user. It makes a direct reference into an indirect reference. Another technique is to specify an object relative to a user. For example, instead of using a simple database ID to display a receipt, a website could instead find the user and then look for the user's third receipt. It requires finding the user In this movie, we'll talk about the importance of regulating access privileges to ensure good access control. Many office buildings have security guards that regulate access. Someone working in the building may have access to only certain floors or certain departments. And even within those areas, there may be spaces that are off limits to them, such as a server room, a supply closet, or even certain filing cabinets. These real-world examples of limiting access make common sense. Some people have access, while others don't. And people are only given additional access privileges when it's necessary. In the same way, we should set access privileges for websites by following the principle of least privilege. Every program and every privileged user of the system should operate using the least amount of privilege that's necessary to complete the job. The principle of least privilege means giving a user only those privileges which are essential to that user's work and nothing more. If a user's job is to edit website text, then they shouldn't be able to browse a list of paying customers. Users in human resources should not be able to see accounting information, and users in accounting should not be able to see human resource information. The principle of least privilege can be applied to APIs, system resources, database access, and software version control too. The principle of least privilege increases security because any vulnerabilities are limited. It's always bad to have an account hacked, but the damage is less if the hacked account has limited privileges. Only high-level admins should have permissions that set or change other user permissions. No regular user should be able to change their own permissions or the permissions of others. Be thoughtful about how your site is organized, how your code is organized, and how the privileges are organized. It may be helpful to group actions together. For example, a website may not need 3 separate privileges to view a photo, to upload a photo, and to delete a photo. It might be sufficient to have one privilege that allows a user to manage photos in a variety of ways. It can also be helpful to group users. Role-based access control, or RBAC, is a technique for assigning users to a role and then controlling the access for that role. For example, a user might be assigned a paid subscriber role, and all users with that role have identical permissions. It makes administration easier and mistakes less likely, especially over time as the code, content, and the users change. Content areas of the website can also be grouped. If a website has roles defined for admins, editors, partners, and users, then it may be wise to organize content areas into something like those same categories. Any techniques that help to keep access controls in the right places and easy to manage over time can be beneficial. Drawing pictures and maps can help you to keep track of privileges and to identify any gaps. It's also important to establish procedures to remove access privileges. If a user leaves your organization, or if a user is a contractor or temporary worker, you may need to cut off Cookies and sessions play an important role in controlling user access. That's because they are common ways to store the evidence that a user has been authenticated. After a user logs in successfully, a website needs to store some evidence of that authentication so that a user can access additional pages without needing to re-authenticate themselves on each one. I often describe it like the wristband that you might get at a concert or an event. You show your ticket to authenticate yourself, and you get a wristband that allows you to move around without having to show your ticket over and over. The wristband in this case is usually data that's put into a cookie or in the session file so that requests for future pages have easy access to it. That authentication data is valuable, and we need to keep it secure. Cookies and sessions can be stolen through snooping, by using JavaScript, or through other clever tricks. If an attacker can get access to this data, the attacker can assume another user's identity, just like if they stole the user's credentials. There are measures we can take to protect cookies and sessions. You should use HTTPS and secure cookies. You declare a cookie as being secure when you set it. A browser will only send secure cookies to the server if the request is being sent over an HTTPS connection, which prevents snooping on cookie data while it's in transit. You should also use HTTP-only cookies. That will prevent JavaScript from being able to steal a cookie. You should regenerate session identifiers periodically at key points, such as right after the user logs in. This helps to prevent session fixation attacks, where the hacker tricks a user into using a session value they already control. You should log out users automatically after some period of time. For example, if a user's last login was more than 1 week ago, make them log in again. You should also remove old session files regularly. Don't leave them laying Deny lists and geofilters are 2 types of access control that you might consider implementing at some point. Deny lists define users or requests that should be denied access. It could be a database of banned users. It could be a list of IP addresses that have caused problems in the past. Or we might deny any request that has certain characteristics. For example, many websites put a robots.txt file at the root of the site, which specifies which search engines and other web crawlers should be denied access to which parts of a website. Your code could also similarly control access based on characteristics like user agent strings. Deny lists can be applied in your web application code, in your web server, or in your firewall settings. As one example, Fail to Ban is popular software for Unix that monitors the web server log files looking for suspicious activity, and then it updates the firewall rules with a deny list to reject those IP addresses for a certain period of time. Geofiltering may make sense for some websites. Geofiltering is allowing or denying service based on the country or region of each request. It can also be used to provide different services or configurations in different areas. There may be legal reasons to do it. Some website content may be restricted by laws, or by copyright, or by contracts that require determining the access by country. Or a website might decide not to comply with certain location-specific regulations, such as the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, also known as GDPR. If you're geofiltering, be aware that VPN services can circumvent geofilters. Anyone can use VPN software to connect to a server that's in another country or region. All requests that the user makes to a website will appear to be coming from that region. The user has geo-shifted themselves to the new location. In this movie, we will discuss single sign-on services and the role that they play in authentication and access control. A single sign-on service is when a user logs into one system with one set of credentials and is able to access other separate but related systems too. Google services are a great example. When you log into Google, you can access Gmail, YouTube, and Google Documents without having to re-authenticate yourself each time. These are separate services running on separate servers with different databases. But Google owns all of them and maintains your identity across them. When you visit a new server, it asks the main Google services if you've been authenticated already. There are benefits to single sign-on services. The user can move between systems without re-authenticating, and that saves time and provides a better user experience. The user has fewer passwords to manage and to remember. In many cases, it will not provide your credentials to each website. For example, YouTube doesn't need a copy of your credentials stored in its database. It just needs to be able to ask Google to vouch for your authenticity. There are also some drawbacks to single sign-on services. The value of one set of credentials increases. One set of credentials grants access to many services. That's a really good reason to strengthen the protections around the single sign-on service and require robust multi-factor authentication. Leaving a single sign-on service provider, you remove your access to other sites. For example, it's common for websites to let users log in using their Facebook account as a single sign-on service. If a user does that and then decides to give up their Facebook account someday, the user may lose their access and user history with that website. A single sign-on service will also know when you visit the related websites. If you log into a website using Facebook, then Facebook knows every time you visit that website. Many people won't mind, but it is something for you to be aware of. And if one service needs to ask another for your authentication status, then network availability can become a failure point. A user can't log in if the network or the remote server goes down. Thank you for taking web security, user authentication, and access control with me. I hope that you've gained an understanding of why authentication and access control are important, how they work, and what some of the considerations are for when you're designing websites. This has been a high-level overview to guide your future work. Your next steps are to research how to implement specific authentication and access control methods in your preferred programming language or application framework. The fundamentals of user authentication and access control can be applied to any system. Together, we can build a more secure web, one that protects users and keeps data secure while still being easy to use. Until next time, happy coding!